as they're listed in the booklet itself. That is Fikro Negash Gebrkidan, who's an associate professor of history at St. Thomas University in Canada. And our second speaker to follow him, my colleague at Cornell, Professor Aishan Hutchinson, who is associate professor in the English department and in the graduate writing program at Cornell University, Ithaca, United States, and Professor Nadia Noor Hussein, who's an associate professor in the English and Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Craig School of Arts and Sciences in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. Welcome everyone to this panel. I just want to mention that the CV of each one there, they're all highly accomplished scholars, known within their field. And so let me welcome, there are just few things that I want to mention. I don't know if these are just ground rules in terms of how we're going to move ahead. Each of the presenters have a limited time, of course, to do the presentation. Once it's finished, each one after the other, we'll open up the discussion. We want people to really be mindful of time, as there is something like a question and answer and discussion too. All the participants now are actually given the privilege of coming in, and by participant, I mean everybody who's participating in this conference as a panelist in this panel or any others. They can enter as with the same privilege as panelists and participate. All they need is to just unmute themselves and also show their video and enter if they have questions, but at the same time, they can also raise their hands, and anybody who's working on Zoom is, I think by now got used to the idea of how to raise a question or interfere or interject or with an argument. So let me start by welcoming Professor Fikro Negash Gebrkidan, who will be presenting a paper titled Unmarked Treasure, Du Bois and his 1930 Memorandum to the Ethiopian Government. So join me in welcoming Professor Fikro Negash Gebrkidan.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So thank you, Professor Hassan, for that kind introduction. And thank you to all conference organizers, including, well, especially Dr. Elsabet Wolde-Gergis for the invitation. It's a privilege and honor being part of this conference and part of today's panel. The title of my paper is Unmarked Treasure, W.E.B. Du Bois and his 1930 Memorandum to the Ethiopian government. My paper is what historians would call a primary source analysis paper. It is very straightforward, very traditional, narrative, interpretive. And the primary source in question is Du Bois's 1930 correspondence with Kentiba Gebru Desta in Melaku Beyan. I call the document a treasure because the ideas, suggestions, and recommendations raised in the paper by Du Bois would have quite an impact on the Ethiopian government and the way it grappled with challenges of modernity in areas such as international loan, dependency, non-alignment, white privilege, and of course, the politics of Pan-Africanism. My paper would take me about 22 or 23 minutes. So if I go over by two or three more minutes over the limit, please my apologies to all of you. All right. So in July 1930, a memo from Professor Alain Locke alerted W.E.B. Du Bois, Dean of the Black Intelligentsia and leading civil rights activist, of the upcoming call to his office by two eminent guests. Kentiba Gebru Desta was on his way. I'll repeat this, please. Kentiba Gebru Desta, seasoned Ethiopian statesman, was on his way to the United States to negotiate a bank loan for a dam project on Lake Tana. Construction work was already contracted to J.G. White Engineering of New York City, and the dam was to be built at the mouth of Lake Tana, where the Blue Nile began its long meandering course. Serving as assistant to Desta was Lij Malaku Bayan, a graduate student at Howard University Medical School. During a stopover in Paris, the Ethiopians had caught up with Professor Locke, one of Bayan's mentors at Howard University, whose letter of introduction to Du Bois they had solicited. Du Bois could not have been more ecstatic. Recently, there were rumors of a commission of Abyssinians coming here, which was to visit me, but I have seen nothing of it. He was to confide to a friend even before a fortnight had lapsed since receipt of Locke's dispatch. Mid-August saw the long-awaited moment to come to pass. Twice, Desta and Bayan had called on Du Bois at 69 Fifth Avenue, the Manhattan headquarters of the NAACP. Du Bois's follow-up correspondence began with the recognition of what he felt was a historic moment. Gentlemen, I wish to assure you first of my personal gratification at coming for the first time in direct communication with Ethiopia. Enclosed was a rough draft of policy recommendations to the Ethiopian government entitled a memorandum to His Excellency Kentiba Gebru and Mr. Malaku Bayan. The 9-page document opened with highlights of African American achievements, a rich tradition of resistance, ongoing struggle for civil rights, contributions to art and literature, and vibrant institutions of higher learning and economic life. Summaries of the 1919, 1921, 1924, and 1926 Pan-African Congresses followed, branching into depth analysis of the European domination of the world economy through the manipulation of capital, credit, and patent laws. Regarding international politics, tips on tactical alliances were offered, such as the need for the anti-colonial forces in Africa and Asia to close ranks with the anti-imperial powers of Germany and the Soviet Union. Then the discussion shifted to bread and butter issues. Ethiopia needed to embrace the gold standard for the sake of a stable currency, the memorandum advised. Along with that, the government had to modernize the national economy, such as by keeping records of income and expenditure, as well as by creating a national banking and credit system. When negotiating with foreign powers, Ethiopian diplomats had to watch out for any sugar-coated, costly business dealings. They had to learn from the negative examples of China, Egypt, and Algeria, countries whose national sovereignty was compromised because of the debt trap set by Western financial institutions. Quote, usually loans to colored countries are for political effect, with the idea they're not going to be paid and that eventually the creditor country can foreclose and secure political control, Du Bois forewarned. Such loans are, of course, highly dangerous, and I hope Ethiopia will not consider them. A modernizing society needed to invest in an elite brain trust in its technocratic class. That was the position Du Bois had consistently promoted in response to Booker T. Washington's gospel of low-level vocational training in Black higher education. In the Ethiopian context, this translated into an all-out modernization scheme through the transfer of industrial technology. until Ethiopian institutions could roll out their version of the talented 10th. They could draw on the untapped reservoir of diaspora resources. The benefit was mutual, according to Du Bois. Like Japan after the Meiji Restoration, Ethiopia would enter into a steady course of rapid industrialization, and for a surplus of African American college graduates and artisans, such overseas projects would provide gainful employment and unique life experience. Quote, Ethiopia should immediately seek to attract to her borders a set of young colored engineers trained in modern industrial technique, Du Bois prescribed. She should have aviators to develop airways all over the country. She should have metallurgists, iron and steel makers, chemists, physicists, and electricians trained in every branch of modern technique. Here, it is worth pointing out that Du Bois's vision of mutual self-uplift differed markedly from Marcus Garvey's ideology of racial nationalism. While Du Bois understood that African modernity did not have to reinvent the wheel, he understood a great racial disparity in fields such as finance, manufacturing, and international law. In that case, the Ethiopian government stood much to gain not only from the mobilization of overseas race patriots, but also from the active recruitment of world-class white professionals. Lest the familiar history of colonial racism entrench itself in the process, Du Bois suggested practical checks and balances. First, Euro-American candidates could be carefully screened so that only those with progressive racial views were hired. And second, actual decision-making responsibilities could be shared between such white appointees and their Ethiopian or African American deputies. Some of the above pronouncements, such as the need to tap, I'm sorry, I'm getting some disruptive emails. I'm sorry, my apologies. All right, some of the above pronouncements, such as the need to tap into diaspora labor pool, were popular ideas that Ethiopian officials such as Hakim Workneh Eshete, aka Dr. Charles Martin, had entertained since the mid-1920s. Others bore the peculiarly Du Boisian trademark of anti-colonial nationalism. In this regard, the memorandum was as much a political manifesto as it was an economic roadmap. For example, Desta and Bayin were to organize in New York and Washington as many brainstorming sessions as possible before heading back home. Then, according to Du Bois, quote, a fifth Pan-African Congress should be called to meet no later than 1932 at Addis Ababa. And at this Congress, efforts should be made to have leading groups of Africans of the world represented. Remember, he was writing this in 1940, not in the 1960s, but the ideas are very, very similar, but he wrote this in 1930. Desta and Bayan sailed back to Ethiopia in time for their sovereign's grand coronation ceremony in November 1930. An immediate accomplishment of their overseas mission was the recruiting of two white Americans, Everett A. Colson and Ernest F. Work, to fill top-level advisory positions in the ministries. Another outcome was much more subtle. Cognizant of Du Bois's advice that international entanglements over Lake Tana could indeed turn into a Trojan horse on national sovereignty, Desta and Bayan prevailed on their government to silently back out from the loan acquisition scheme. On the other hand, no Pan-African meeting took place in 1932 in Addis Ababa, although, as we shall see, the vision would inspire the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in the long term. Neither did Du Bois's alternative loan venture fully pan out. His memorandum had suggested that bank loans be sought out only as a last resort and only from countries such as the United States and Germany, countries that posed fewer risks of colonial entanglement. To that end, Du Bois had even offered to liaise between the Ethiopian delegates and the Harlem-based Dunbar National Bank. The Dunbar National Bank was a bank that catered primarily for African-American clients. I think it was owned by the Rockefeller family. A delegation from Abyssinia has visited me twice for information and advice. He wrote to the bank requesting a meeting with its president. President Charles Hewitt obliged, but his response arrived too late, perhaps a day or two after Du Bois had already declared the initiative a failure. The more I think of it, the more I'm convinced that nothing can be done with the banks of the United States at present, his message of August 21st to Desta and Bayan lamented. Such immediate setbacks notwithstanding, Du Bois's memorandum would have lasting resonance in Ethiopian politics. In fact, by chance or design, its recommendations would constitute a de facto policy blueprint. Throughout the 1930s, for example, the Ethiopian government maintained an open door policy towards Black repatriation. True, because of high political profile, white expatriates enjoyed a much more visible presence in the bureaucracy. Still, as Du Bois had counseled, relatively sympathetic racial sentiments factored in the vetting process of such individuals. Aforementioned Colson, the man Desta and Bayan hired to spearhead their government's legal department, was a case in point. Of the list of candidates submitted to them by the State Department, Desta and Bayan settled on the seasoned public accountant from the state of Maine, distinguished by many years of service to the Caribbean nation of Haiti. Until his death in 1937, Colson would remain Haile Selassie's most trusted advisor, perhaps even the most influential foreigner since the Swiss-born Alfred Elk, Emperor Menelik's famous confidant. So here I'm using Colson as an example where Desta and Bayan used the criteria provided to them by Du Bois to handpick Colson, in part because of his progressive racial views, and in part because he actually had worked in Haiti for quite a while, and then he turned out to be a very successful employee of the Ethiopian government in the early 1930s. And he was not the only one. Likewise, Ernest Work, the other American recruit, had mentored Bayan and his two other compatriots while they were undergraduate students at Muskingum College in Ohio. Once in Ethiopia, Work's name would become synonymous with a major educational reform policy. Ties with African-American academics distinguished Work from most of his contemporaries, and the white professor was erroneously described as Afro-American by a leading North American Ethiopianist, the late Harold G. Marcus. Evident was also Du Bois's signature on fiscal policy. As might be remembered, the 1930 memorandum had suggested the establishment of a national bank as one of the imperatives of a modern economy. In 1931, Haile Selassie liquidated the foreign-owned Bank of Abyssinia, considered a factor in the country's worsening financial woes, including the unfavorable balance of trade because of a weakened Maria Theresa thaler. That was the Ethiopian currency, for those who don't know what the Maria Theresa was. In its place was established the government-owned National Bank of Ethiopia, much of the initial capital having been raised by the emperor himself. Likewise, loan negotiations for the dam construction discreetly seized, a cautionary measure against potential entanglement with the predatory multinationals. Imperial Ethiopia would continue as a poor but relatively debt-free country into the 1960s, into the post-war decades. And in 1960, Du Bois would feel vindicated by his own wisdom of some 30 years prior. I have read with great interest in the New York Times the report of your speech at the meeting of independent African nations, his missive to Haile Selassie read. I write to thank you for the speech and especially for its warning to Africa not to become dependent upon loans from Europe and America. And of course, he wrote that in 1960, 30 years after the memorandum that I'm talking about here in my paper. In the diplomatic arena too, worth mentioning was Du Bois's advice for the need for making common cause with the secondary powers in Europe and Asia as a deterrence to global imperialism. In 1931, Ethiopian Foreign Minister Haile Selassie visited Japan, an event that did not pass unnoticed in the influential papers of Europe and North America. Relationships with Germany remained stable, not only in the days of the Weimar Republic, but also through the early years of the Third Reich. This de facto policy of non-alignment would continue into the Cold War decades, during which Haile Selassie commanded as many fans behind the Iron Curtain as he did in the Western capitals. Finally, the memorandum represented a unique chapter in transoceanic race relations. Scores of working-class African Americans, including aviation extraordinaire John C. Robinson, the Brown Condor, migrated to East Africa in the early 1930s. Serving as godfather to whom the pioneers turned for help was the now familiar Gebru Desta, one of whose own sons lived and worked with a team of African American land surveyors near Lake Tana. Few could have seen the tragic turn of events that was soon to unfold, however, and most of the newcomers would scurry back to the United States on the eve of the Italian invasion, bringing the earnest Back to Africa experiment to an unfortunate and premature conclusion. In the United States, Du Bois would continue corresponding with Malaku Bayan, 30 years his junior. Bayan, who only a year later broke his engagement to the daughter of a government minister to marry, in order to marry an African-American schoolmate, Dorothy Hadley of Evanston, Illinois, would prove to be a uniquely gifted Pan-African interlocutor. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 forced Bayan, despite his training as a medical doctor, into a life of activism as anti-fascist crusader, fundraiser, and newspaper editor. His sudden death in 1940 would leave a gap in Ethiopian African-American relations that no future kindred spirit was able to fill. He was an ambassador of Pan-Africanism in a singularly happy sense, Du Bois eulogized, adding, "Then came war, conquest, and disaster. He struggled bravely and died in his 40th year from what men call pneumonia and angels know as a broken heart." That was Du Bois's eulogy to Malaku Bayan. Conclusion. Traumatized and inward-looking, Ethiopian intellectuals who survived the Italian Holocaust were not as tickled by the broader worldview of Desta and Bayan. Ethiopian Pan-Africanism would have to simmer on the back burner for another couple of decades, at least until the early 1960s. Post-war Du Bois, on the other hand, would play an active role in campaigning for Eritrea's return to Ethiopia through newspaper columns and public lectures. It was a conviction he had expressed in the 1930 memorandum. It should, of course, be a fixed object of Ethiopian diplomacy to obtain an ocean port, the use of free port like Massawa or Djibouti, but eventually a port that Ethiopia absolutely owns, he had argued. At the founding conference of the United Nations in San Francisco in May 1945, Du Bois confabed briefly with Ethiopia's most senior officials, whom he generously dubbed a delegation of intelligence and insight. Another encounter followed 3 years later at the Ethiopian legation in Washington, D.C., and during which the retiring NAACP leader expressed his hope for a Pan-African gathering on independent African soil. Du Bois's last wish would become real 15 years later, and no less during a critical juncture in African political history. At the wee hours of May 25, 1963, the All Africa Summit in Ethiopia concluded with the signing of the founding charter of the OAU, of the Organization of African Unity, a feat few had then thought was possible. Du Bois was too frail to leave his newly found abode in Accra, Ghana, but his wife was in Addis Ababa, witnessing in person the historic occasion. Shirley Graham Du Bois, who flew in with the Ghanaian government delegation, considered the creation of the OAU as a major milestone, describing it in superlatives as probably the most important gathering so far in the century. She was not wrong. When seen from the perspective of her husband, the founding of the OAU was more than a grand moment in African history. It represented the fulfillment of a lifelong vision, which Du Bois had spelled out in the 1930 memorandum, a document whose profound impact on the Ethiopian government is gradually becoming clear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fikru, for a very enlightening paper. And I'm sure we will have a lot of questions. That's actually will be also a continuation from yesterday, as some of these issues have been tackled. But it's interesting what you brought in as a focus exactly on the Du Bois memorandum. So Professor Nadia Noor Hussein, you're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to the conference organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel today, and thank you to those of you in attendance. I'm so honored to be on this panel with my co-panelists. I'm a professor of African American literature, that's my specialization, and my remarks today are in fact adapted from a chapter of my book. The full title is actually Black Land, Imperial Ethiopianism and African America is the subtitle. I discuss in this chapter poetry written by African Americans, largely in response to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s. Much of it inspired by what I have called martial Ethiopianism. So I'll just begin there. With a claim to the throne that rested upon an alleged direct line of ancestry reaching back to King Solomon, Emperor Haile Selassie was exhibited and lionized as the visible incarnation of the country's antiquity and permanence. To honor a Black king, as Wilson Jeremiah Moses and others have argued, proves troublesome from a democratic Pan-African perspective, and yet there is a persistent tension between the desire to celebrate the grandiosity of a historic Black empire on the one hand, and the commitment to democratic ideals on the other. We see the celebration of pharaohs, for example, in the work of Meta Warwick Fuller in her pre-Harlem Renaissance sculpture, Ethiopia Awakening, and later in her protege, Lois Mailou-Jones's painting, Ascent of Ethiopia, with both visual artists conflating Ethiopia and Egypt in order to articulate diaspora through the glorification of royalty. The pomp of Haile Selassie's 1930 coronation was marked by the first of 2 Time magazine cover photos of the emperor, and this cover arguably heralded the start of American and especially African American fascination with the figure. The paradox of imperial Ethiopianism, that is, a reverential attitude toward the Ethiopian regal line, existing side by side but at odds with a democratic and collective approach to Black solidarity, runs throughout African American literature of the 1930s dealing with Ethiopia. Poets as varied as J. Harvey L. Baxter, Melvin B. Tolson, Langston Hughes, and countless others wrote verse intended as calls to action, encouraging readers to rally in support of the Ethiopian cause. But they often did so through the praising of exemplary regal icons despite ostensibly fighting for justice and equality. In many cases, these regal icons of the 1930s were depicted in their roles as soldiers. The title of this talk then gestures toward this ideological perspective, a Pan-African Black nationalist perspective filtered through the bifocal lenses of militarism and imperialism. The collective voices calling for racial solidarity in support of the Ethiopian cause were harnessed, distilled, and expressed by both celebrated and obscure African-American poets into the individualized lyric voice of the Ethiopian imperial military hero. And this will be familiar to many of you, but when the headlines announced that Italy had invaded Ethiopia in 1935, African Americans called upon historical reserves of sympathy for the nation, reserves drawing from both its ancient symbolism and its modern signification, echoing in this duality the contemporaneous journalistic discourse, and held mass meetings, protests, parades, and boycotts in its support. Viewed not only through the lens of racial solidarity, but also through a familiar ideology of Ethiopianism, Mussolini's attempt to colonize Ethiopia was met with a remarkably unified African-American response. It would be reductive to view aid for Ethiopia as simply altruistic, although it was that. It was also believed to be an act of self-preservation. Giving support and sympathy, Black communities across the United States condemned Italy and demanded action. The speaker of a poem by J. Harvey L. Baxter, called To the Barefoot Lads, yearns to fight in Ethiopia, romantically and patriotically comparing the shoeless and underarmed Ethiopian troops to those led by Washington at Valley Forge, saying, quote, "Oh, how I wish that I could be with the barefoot lads across the sea, and with some Ras could take my stand to fight or die for the fatherland." The occasional verse written for periodicals during the war often depicted military scenes, immortalizing Ethiopian military heroes in verse. In July 1937, The Crisis published a poem by J.N. Hill titled An Ethiop in Spain, inspired by a son of Ras Imru fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Although the Ethiopian soldier fights alongside Americans and Europeans, Hill cannot conceive of him as a truly modern equal, viewing him instead through a romantic and atavistic lens. This is a quotation from the poem. "Silent man of the past, he seemed heroic. Through dissolution and forced exile, through faded visions of Adwa, of ancient streets in Addis Ababa, of mountains and muddy roads in Abyssinia, where barefoot men trudged their way through centuries of peace and calmly roamed the hills," close quote. Not only is the soldier trapped in a nebulous fantasy of the past, he is a literary fiction before he even enters Hill's poem, as he is measured against a Shakespearean invention. The poem begins with the declaration that, quote, "No jewel shone in this Ethiop's ear." The soldier is voiceless, unable to communicate with his fellow soldiers in Italian, Spanish, French, or English. Not even his Amharic is flexible enough to express the inscrutable depths of the soldier, as, quote, "language could not match the eloquence of his silence." The exotic prince is not a fellow soldier, but a mute and timeless symbol of what they are fighting for. The Ethiopian language does, however, make its way into Melvin Tolson's The Bard of Addis Ababa, which, as John Cullen Gruser points out, quote, "evinces an impressive familiarity with Ethiopian history, culture, and geography." Tolson has clearly done his research, integrating esoteric Amharic words into his poem. Discussion of Tolson's manipulations of modernist techniques and strategies, particularly the use of scholarly apparatuses reminiscent of T.S. Eliot's footnotes to The Wasteland, abound in scholarship about his work. Unlike his Harlem Gallery, however, the Bard of Addis Ababa is not accompanied by notes. The poem is included in Rendezvous with America, a collection of poems that, according to Raymond Nelson's editorial statement to Tolson's Harlem Gallery and other poems by Melvin Tolson, are, quote, genuinely straightforward. They can and should be read without supplements. Without knowledge of Amharic, however, the poem remains inaccessible. And in fact, I had to ask my father for help in translating some parts of the poem since I don't speak Amharic. By integrating Amharic words and concepts into his poem, rather than, for instance, Greek or Latin, Tolson dignifies African systems of knowledge, granting these references the same authority typically given to classical ones, and in the process obscures the poem for Eurocentric readers. In fact, in Tolson's poem, the Italian soldiers, effectively descended from a Latinate tradition, literally pale in comparison to the vitality of the African traditions embodied in the Bard of Addis Ababa. In contrast to the dull, pedestrian, quote, granite-eyed Italians, the Ethiopian bard has eyes that are, quote, glowing like anthracite. And I'm going to quote quite a bit from Tolson's poem here. I hope it'll be clear which parts are quotations. Carrying with him the lore of 6,000 years, the bard's gravitas is rooted in his timelessness. If he seems immortal, he is also paradoxically eternally dead. Tolson introduces the bard as, quote, cadaverous. But the bard's Lazarus-like quality is, of course, in keeping with the Ethiopianist ideology that prophesies the revitalization of a dormant Ethiopia. The poem, in fact, concludes with the Ethiopian soldiers' call to those long slumbering descendants as the bard, accompanied by a dog, walks into the future, quote, a great dog and a gray beard ahead, O bard of Addis Ababa, cry the heroes to wake up the dead, close quote. The dog by the bard's side here is the very dog with which the poem opens, apparently stray and vicious, a foreboding omen of the fight between Italy and Ethiopia. Quote, his growl presaging a menace like a foghorn in a fog, close quote. Along with the hyena and a boa, the dog, quote, rips the jackal with scimitar, tooth, and claw. Since the jackal is a symbol of Italy and Mussolini, used again later in the poem, the dog comes to represent not just the general harbinger of war, but Ethiopia's role in the war specifically. The destruction of the jackal is Tolson's prophecy that Ethiopia will ultimately triumph over Italy. Not only does the bard's, quote, chant of men fleshed in epic, close quote, but he holds a unifying and tremendous power in every community through which he travels. A, quote, hero of Grasmach and vendor of Hakim and beggar and wag, Grasmach being significantly a military designation. Although he is primarily a, quote, blooded Amharic scholar, he is literally an acknowledged legislator whose name is the emblem of justice. Outdoor courts invoke him to sentence man or beast, and debtors chained to their masters appeal to the bard for release. In affording this level of authority to another poet, Tolson imagines an active role for the poet in the world, as one, for example, who would and could influence the carrying out of justice by inspiring a change of course in the Italo-Ethiopian War, just as Baxter hoped to accomplish. Lorenzo Thomas, in fact, claims that the bard's influence as both the bearer, this is a quote from Lorenzo Thomas, as, quote, both the bearer of tradition and the people's inspiration is a role that Tolson coveted for himself, close quote. Faced with the injustice of the Italian occupation, the bard embodies a populist heroism as he, quote, chants of the freedoms that keep men free. He serves as a human repository, of patriotic and democratic national history, and a warrior besides, complete with dagger, wandering under his forefather's flag as if he is marching under a pennant. As a versifier, he can inspire others to action, particularly military action, through the battle cry of his ballads. This is a quotation, the battle cry of his ballads, the meter's blood-spurring pace, the star reach of his spearing finger. He and his military mission even appear to be sanctioned by God, with a halo-like diadem of light. This is a longer quotation from the poem. Princes and bishops and scholars, pyramid to left and right, of the conquering Lion of Judah and the diadem of light, and the red and gold pavilion glitters with vassal and knight. The bard appears to have merged with the emperor here. Just as the Ethiopian royal family claimed a line of descent that linked them to a Solomonic dynasty, the bard's fight appears to fulfill biblical destiny. He mobilizes the Ethiopian peoples by pointing them toward their religiously determined fate. However, the bard's inspiration relies upon the usual fantasy of universal regalization, which I discuss in my book as one of the features intrinsic to imperial Ethiopianism. That is the fantasy in which anyone and everyone can be a historic king, or at least descended from one. The implied tension between inclusivity as a universally available fantasy and exclusivity as a fantasy that necessarily excludes others from similar exaltation is in fact embedded in the Ethiopianist ideology. In the bard's chant, which constitutes section 2 of the poem, he suggests that with the Ethiopian warriors' defeat of the Italians, quote, a ras, a dejasmach, a king, Yoho, each father's son shall be, close quote. Crowns are in fact everywhere in this poem. The quote, palaver house shall crown the kith and kin of man. The bard himself wears a quote, bejeweled corona befitting a ras or a chamberlain, as barbaric splendor crowns him. Even the aforementioned diadem of light may be grouped with these crowns. That Tolson cannot resist the proliferation of crowns here signals the presence of the fantasy of universal regalization at work. The appeal of imperial Ethiopianism extended even to those critical of the emperor, such as Marcus Garvey, whose growing disdain for Selassie's imperiousness was compounded by a personal slight. He was snubbed when he attempted to meet with Selassie in England. In 1937, Garvey published in his own periodical, Black Man, at least 2 elegies dedicated to Ethiopian military heroes, Ras Nasibu of Ogaden and Ras Desta, and both notably praise a military strength shaped and informed by imperial culture. For the thoroughly imperial Garvey, the crucial difference between Selassie on the one hand and Nasibu and Desta on the other lies in the latter's military sacrifice, rendering them exemplars of not just imperial Ethiopianism, but martial Ethiopianism. The nature of Garvey's veneration of Nasibu as a military hero of the Ethiopian resistance is unmistakably monarchic. He begins Ras Nasibu with the line, a king has fallen on the field. While he criticizes Selassie for fleeing to England, for being, as he puts it, quote, a great coward who ran away from his country to save his skin and left the millions of his countrymen to struggle through a terrible war, Garvey instead pities Nasibu for his, quote, awful lot of dying in exile. Unlike Selassie, Nasibu is a king who lost his part in building glory with his bricks. Although he refers to Nasibu as a king twice, he also implies that he is a model of collective participation, thwarted or snuffed out, who wanted ardently and democratically to do his part. In fact, Garvey reinforces the word part by rhyming it with itself in the poem. Nasibu was not just defending an existing nation, but building one. So rather than abandoning his nation and willfully separating himself from his people, Nasibu, in Garvey's eyes, suffers from a longing common to conceptions of diaspora, the desire for return. In fact, Garvey's claim that a king has fallen on the field, despite his acknowledgement 3 lines later that he did not, he died in exile. As Brent Hayes Edwards reminds us, the term diaspora looks to the future as well as the past and contains within it, quote, a dialectical tension between dispersal and return, loss and restoration. The anticipatory restoration is expressed in Garvey's poem as not just an Ethiopian one, but a Pan-African one. After mourning the loss of Nasibu, Garvey writes, quote, the Negroes of the world shall wait to take their stand against the foe, and when they fight to win their state, they'll make the Italians drink their woe. The weight of the Ethiopian tradition in African-American literature, African-American letters, as Wilson Moses calls it, bore down upon the inevitably shaped modern lyric representations, of the nation, infusing those representations with a romanticism that made criticism of the monarchy unwelcome and difficult. In fact, because Ethiopianism historically drew its power from the dignity and grandeur offered by the idea of an ancient Black empire. So, in fact, because Ethiopianism historically drew its power from the dignity and grandeur offered by the idea of an ancient Black empire, anti-monarchical views could be seen as undermining the essence of the Ethiopianist perspective upon which the poetry about the war depended. Although criticism of Selassie increased during World War II, particularly during his exile in England, his iconic signification still bolsters Ethiopianist ideologies today. The celebration of Ethiopian imperial culture, particularly through the figure of martial Ethiopianism, remained a powerful propagandistic tool throughout the Italo-Ethiopian War. Because the dramatic events taking place in Ethiopia in the 1930s were filtered for many African Americans through the country's long and profound symbolism, Ethiopia was simultaneously a topical and deep-rooted subject for Harlem Renaissance poetry. These poems often constituted calls for action, particularly military action, entreating the diaspora to summon a consanguineous sympathy and come to the aid of what was both an ancestral home and the seat of an historic Black empire. Ethiopia was not any longer, as Gibbon dismissively called it, forgotten and sleeping, and African America dedicated verse to the nation as it fought for its sovereignty on the world stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nadia, for also a great presentation through poetry this time. And I think if I look at the whole session, I find it really complementary to each other and also form an extension of some of the debates that we have in the opening session and in the keynote speech too. I think I'm glad that this is now carried in more depth in the three presentations. If I may just sum up, and perhaps in the context of my summaries of the major points, I may raise a question or two, and hopefully that will begin our debate. I wouldn't take that much time. Looking at Professor Fikru Gebrekidane's paper, it gave us actually an in-depth look at the memorandum, that rare document, what you call it, unmarked treasure, given by Du Bois to the delegation of Ethiopians. It gave us a kind of an amazing look at how Du Bois was thinking, but it's also how African Americans at the time thinking about Ethiopia specifically. It's a continuation, of course, of looking at it from an idealist perspective, but it's also motivated by what we now know as racial solidarity. But in the case of Du Bois specifically, I mean, I think his own intellectual, you could see his early, for example, perhaps more what became later on a more Marxist leaning. He was focusing on development and an early critique of dependency, which is, of course, in the mid to, with the decolonization becomes a very important question that you see later on in Fanon and others, the idea of how one could, avoid the pitfalls of development and dependency on the West that end up in what we know now as the crisis of the post-colonial state. There are two thoughts that I have in this, and I don't know if Fikro could reflect on them. One of them is when, at that time, of course, when I think by that time, probably Booker T. Washington, his nemesis, must have passed away. but the debate towards Africa, or the debate towards the African American, the black subject, both of them saw it in a different way. Although they are both advocates for civil rights, and often Booker T. Washington, by perspective of today, or even Du Bois, was criticized more because he really advocated some limited development that's considered really most likely appeasing to the white dominant, a power at the time that is focusing on vocational education and self-dependency and uplifting, but in a way that does not enter into what Du Bois think of as, in his book, The Talented Tens, where he was really talking about intellect, about contribution to humanities, letters, and so forth as one way of really uplifting the race. I mean, of course, he's not underestimating education, but his view of it is really to think about African Americans and the black subject as full subject, full citizen, and calling for that. I wonder if you have any reflection on thinking just historically in the present, as one would say, about these earlier two perspectives, considering what we now know in terms of what is happening with the post-colonial state in Africa. It's interesting how it's almost like a deja vu that the last one was his critique of the dam that's built on Lake Tana. Now, I mean, the hottest debate in the continent is the whole issue of the Nile Valley along the countries, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt. That whole thing about the new Renaissance dam, given a new name, but of course, it is probably motivated by the same in terms of generating electricity, irrigation, and all of those. I don't know if you have any reflection on those. Aishan presentation in a very poetic way, whether it is as prose or poetry that he used to punctuate his presentation, of course, in and of itself is a piece of art and a great performance, add more complex to what it came to be known as the narratives of return. For him, he added Ethiopia, and while when we think about these narratives of return by diasporic intellectuals, we find the most two examples, and I'm sure there are many one could think of, even from Richard Wright to many people who really spoke about Africa or wrote letters to Nkrumah and others. But there's Saidiya Harman, Lose Your Mother, A Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Routes. And then Maya Angelou's works, that is All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes and The Heart of a Woman. Of course, they're intertwined as kind of autobiographical. One is written, from what I recall, this is like a long time that I didn't go back to it. It's in forms of letters out of our experience in Accra, Ghana. And of course, this narrative of return sometime in a way that may be bordered on sarcasm when you think about Henry Louis Gates' film about Ghana, when he said that African Americans arrived to Ghana before him, very enthusiastic to being in Africa and embraced by Africans, and suddenly throwing their, as he said, metaphorically, I guess, throwing their passport in the Atlantic Ocean. And then he said a few days after that, they came back to look for their passport when they realized that the realities is not that they would be welcomed with an open hand, and they would be also thought of as different or as different than them. And I would love for you to think about these narratives of return, because yours is different, coming from the Caribbean through Ethiopia that has this long legacy within Ethiopianism, Rastafarianism, and so forth. But there's also something interesting. I don't know if that figure out in your journey is these Caribbean Rastafarians who sought land there and sought to be part of seeking. So, but from what I know, among the contestation is that up till now they were not given the citizenship. Although they have a land at some point that was assigned to them. I don't know, maybe other people in the audience could think about that, because these are some of the realities on the ground, where within the context of the post-colonial state, Ethiopia has been welcoming, but there's also these contradictions of what to do with Rastafarians and their views in the ground as part of Ethiopia today. There is that group of people. So for Nadia, of course, she takes the paradox, as she called it, of Ethiopianism from a diasporic perspective, focusing on one genre that is within the literature of that part of the creative aspect of the Black diasporic imagination, which is poetry. And with yesterday, I don't know if you were at the panel or not, Nadia, but there was all of these discussions about the contradiction, which is also, you take it here through through poetry. That is, in one way, there is this idealization of Ethiopia, and it is, you know, the whole genealogy of the ruling class, of the ruling elites during the Haile Selassie's time and before that. And then the realities on the ground, which is, we've discussed this yesterday, of opposition to his rule, looking at it as had its own contradictions of impoverishing Ethiopians as feudal system, and the whole opposition to it that still extended till today. Although when we really think, even among Ethiopians today, there are those who are still longing for the monarchy or looking at it as in an idealized form. So, but then when I think about what you have posed and why it has this positive aspect, I mean, of course, I'm neglecting here to discuss or to focus on what you focus on, which is poetry as a genre, but I wanted to take it a step out of this, which is to think about how African Americans, of course, there is no one view of the continent from Africa. It's hard to generalize. There are those who engage in it from a critical perspective or a Pan-African perspective, realizing the realities of Africa and the dependency, and they have their own analysis. But there is also an idealization where you see, even among many of the communities of solidarity in America, is an aversion to the idea of engaging with human rights abuses, with critiquing post-colonial government attitudes. And for example, in the case of Sudan, Darfur and others, there is a hesitation to engage in that. So you find it in university campuses or in solidarity movement with such movement that fight the post-colonial state and its injustices and discrimination and so forth, dominated by white liberals. So African Americans were not engaged in this. But some, of course, are engaged, and I'm not trying to generalize, I'm just saying many, even like, especially officials, like Jesse Jackson and others, when they engage in Africa, they try to engage from a different perspective, which is in support of, but not in critiquing those, and don't engage in this kind of controversial. But I wonder also today, and that's the last just question to you, Nadia, if it's something that you think can be answered, feel free, is that what about poetry today among African American vis-a-vis Africa? It would be interesting to look at the contemporary. Of course, Aishan, as an example, is a poet who is engaged in this, but I think it would be interesting to know what's happening in this field. Does it become more close to the African American experience, or it still had that horizon of that kind of embrace also racial solidarity? I stop here, sorry to take too much time, but feel free if you want to start, Fikro or Aishan or Naiden. Hello? Should I call on Fikro? Are you there with us? Fikro, you have to unmute yourself. Somebody could, Satan, can you unmute him?
Okay, I think I'm okay now.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I think you there was a question about the present day relevance of the, Du Bois Washington debate Ethiopia and possibly to the whole continent as well. I'm not, I don't have much expertise. I don't have much expertise, on that debate. But in brief, what I would like to say really is, it seems unfortunately, and of course, Du Bois and Washington are the two sides of the same coin, really. I mean, it's just a spectrum, right? Because it's very to, dumb down the debate into, protest versus complicity, but obviously it's much more complex than that. But I think in general, I would say it seems unfortunately that most African governments have taken the side of Booker T. Washington, in the sense that less emphasis on social science education, less emphasis on liberal arts education, and much more emphasis on I don't know what even to call it, this cottage industries of of the sciences. But then here I'm putting the sciences in quotation. So to me, it seems the Du Boisian notion of liberal arts education as the engine of society, the talented 10th, really has been either ignored or even totally defeated, unfortunately. Of course, we see that in Ethiopia too, where the government, I don't know, they have a policy of, what do they call it, 70% the sciences and 30% of liberal arts education. And yet most of the challenges that African societies are experiencing today, tribalism, and of course, I love to use the word tribalism here. I don't want to use the word ethnicism, because that's like giving it a more positive touch. Ethiopia right now has the most wicked type of tribalism, and I would love to use that word deliberately. Corruption, mindfulness, lack of mindfulness, those things would have been better helped with some type of liberal arts training. Obviously, when we talk about transcending differences, and we have differences of all types, either ethnic, class, disability, sexual orientation. Those are the type of things that liberal arts education would have done a good job, if not fixing, at least grappling with them. But unfortunately, they don't do that in Ethiopia and Africa as a whole. So I don't know where I'm heading with this, but what I'm trying to say is really the notion of the talented 10th, the social science, liberal arts education right now, has not gained much attention in most African countries. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Fikro. Nadia?
Yeah, thank you. I think Professor Hutchinson probably is much more familiar with a lot of the contemporary poetry that has been written about Africa, but from my personal reading, my experience is that there's a lot more of the kind of travel writing that you mentioned, Professor Hassan, about, in Sidi Hartman's book, and by poets too. I mean, I was thinking about, not quite contemporary, but Gwendolyn Brooks has written about her travel to Africa as well. So I don't know, I wonder why, there hasn't been as much poetry that directly engages with travel to Ethiopia. And I do hope that there will be something from Professor Hutchinson on that, on his experience. But especially about Shashamene, I think that would be something that a lot of people would be interested to read. As far as the question about the discussion yesterday about Ethiopian exceptionalism and this aversion to critique that you mentioned, Professor Hassan. I think one of the things I kind of touch upon in my book is that I think is something so valuable about this model of imperial Ethiopianism that I tried to sketch out in the book, that it makes challenge or critique difficult because it seems to undermine what the whole ideology is about. Whether or not that's true, it seems like it's very difficult to kind of gain any sort of purchase, when criticizing, the elite or the monarchy. It feels as if, at least until the 30s, there's in the writing about Ethiopia, there's very little direct critique. So I was finding a lot of sort of hints of either internal contradiction about how writers were imagining Ethiopia, but still very little that is openly criticizing, the monarchy. So I think that does change later, and that is part of why I kind of end my book around the 30s. I talk about an experience that Langston Hughes had when he went to Ethiopia in the 60s and met with Haile Selassie and felt very disturbed by the imperial culture that he was confronted with. So I do think you start to notice it later. But yeah, that was my my experience in reading around in literature from the period.
Nadia,
there is a question by Dag Maui Wapshit, if you want to go ahead, Dag.
Oh no, I'm sorry, Salah.
Sorry,
mentioned Langston Hughes now, and I'm curious. Was he involved in writing the Ethiopian anthem, national anthem?
I don't know anything about that. Did you read that somewhere, or?
I thought I read that from your book.
No, I don't think I talked about that. He wrote a poem for Haile Selassie to celebrate. I'm trying to think what anniversary it was. Might have been the 25th anniversary of his restoration. Yeah. So.
No, the anthem was written by
Ford.
Abbey Ford.
Yeah. Yeah. Arnold Ford.
Yes.
Arnold Ford.
That's the UNIA Ethiopian anthem. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Dag Maui Wapshit.
Yes, sure. Let's see, can you turn that on? Salah, let me say, all Fikru, Nadia, Aishan, beautiful presentations. I was initially, when I put myself on cue, I was going to ask the question that that Aishan just answered about the counter-intuitive move as a Jamaican traveling to Ethiopia, but deciding not to write about Shashamene, which would be the expected thing, and to write about Lalibela instead. But my question has been answered.
There is a question.
Could I, Saleh, would you mind if I make a comment here, please, as a follow-up to what has been said so far?
Sure, please go ahead.
Yes, yeah, thank you. One is about travel writings. I think Dr. Nur Hussein and Dr. Jensen have done a good job speaking from the point of view of Ethiopia within the context of, I don't know if I would call it romanticized or the idyllic Ethiopia. But there is a name that I would like to drop because I think it's a very, very crucial name, and much of the African-American travel writings about Ethiopia, even if it doesn't build on what I'm going to say, it at least is a follow-up. And the name that I'm going to drop is Melaku Bayen's wife, I'm sure Dr. Nur Hussein would know who she is, because I have seen her name mentioned in her book. That is Dorothy Hadley Bayan. Dorothy did actually write about her experience in Ethiopia, and those writings could now be found at Yale University's special collections. They're not very extensive, but she has a series of correspondence between herself and her sister, who was situated, I think, in Washington, D.C. as well. So Dorothy writes based on her first-hand experience in Ethiopia. And those writings are actually very sensational. She writes about her experience in Gibbi, the palace. She writes about her experience, like, you know, was like her household experience was just everyday Ethiopians. But unfortunately, no one has tapped into that. You know, to me, this is another, you know, she is another unmarked treasure. You know, there are elements of gender, obviously. She's very comfortable with Ethiopians, with like class. She seems to have transcended the way she was received in the palace. To a degree, it actually contradicts the position taken by Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes, we know him from the poem he wrote, Sons of Shiba's Race. By the way, that's the poem that I think we're trying to remember earlier. But her experience in Ethiopia is phenomenal. By the way, she also spoke some Amharic, Dorothy. She spoke some Amharic. She wrote, she was a correspondent for the New York Amsterdam News. Much of the material that the Amsterdam News published about Ethiopia in 1935, early 1960s, was actually based on what Dorothy was sending from Ethiopia. What else? And then about the Amharic, about the poet that Dr. Nur Hussein mentioned, I think his name is Tolson, the Bard of Addis Ababa. Actually, I'm very fascinated to read that poem as well. But I have a suspicion his Amharic vocabulary might have come from the Amharic lesson that Malaku Bayan and his wife were providing through their newspapers, the Voice of Ethiopia. The Voice of Ethiopia, which began publishing in 1937 and continued to publish until 1941 without any interruption whatsoever. It was a weekly paper. They used to have weekly Amharic lessons. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tolson perhaps may have taken those Amharic lessons and used that for his poem, The Bard of Addis Ababa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Semeni, Ayelo Asfau, I mean, originally sent an S, no, but you're welcome to just join in and ask a question directly.
My question is for Professor Nadia Nur Hussein. So I was wondering, what were they reading about, people like Tolson and Gardi, about Ethiopia? So, I mean, if you can give us, you know, a bibliography list of a sort. I mean, Professor Fukru just mentioned this very interesting, you know, I mean, newspapers published by Malaku Bayan and stuff. But other than that, you know, I mean, a comprehensive scholarly work, something written about Ethiopia in a book form or something. So that was what I was
yeah.
Thank you for the presentations, all of you, really.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, just to kind of to address also what Professor Fikru Gebre said, I think that's a very interesting possibility that he may have been reading Bayan's newspaper and or periodical. I think what I was going to say before he even mentioned that is that the periodical culture, especially African American periodicals, were so well developed at this time. They were extremely popular. I do think that just generally, because Ethiopia was in the news so much in the 1930s, if you look at a sample issue of, you know, Pittsburgh Courier or Baltimore Afro-American or Chicago defender from this time, you'll see the whole issue might be about Ethiopia. I mean, it's just at particular times when there was a lot of, when during battles and things like that, there would be extensive coverage. So the poets were extremely well educated and informed about what was happening, which was one of the sort of reasons that I wanted to write this book about this, how the romantic ideas about Ethiopia that we find, especially in the 19th century, start to become much more informed by historical and current events, really, that writers were becoming very familiar with. So in terms of actual books and things like that, I can't point to anything specific. I'd be curious to know, actually. You often find libraries belonging to poets that you can find a bibliography, but I haven't done that research yet to see what exactly Tolson could be reading in terms of books. But I know that in terms of mass media, there's so much about Ethiopia at this time that they would have been familiar with.
There is,
and don't forget Du Bois, because he did write historical materials on Ethiopia.
Yes.
He was a main resource for the African American community when it comes to historical stuff.
Yes, exactly.
there is a question from, I think from Sorafel, which is to Fikro and to Nadia. Would you please say a few words on Garvey's ambivalent and contradictory position in relation to his response to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the 1930s? And what does that tell us about the fissures on the part of the Black diaspora support for Ethiopia? For instance, when we juxtapose Du Bois and Garvey. Any of you?
Okay, would you like to go first, Dr. Nur Hussein, or?
I'll just say that I briefly mentioned that there was a snub that could have informed part of Garvey's response to Selassie that I read about in the Marcus Garvey and UNIA papers edited by Robert Hill, that sort of magisterial collection of papers. It seems as if part of it could have been personal. This sense that when he approached Selassie in London, that he was not received in the way that he appreciated. But I think also the feeling that Selassie did not live up to what he thought a Black emperor, a Black leader should be. I mentioned that he believed that he was not, that he was cowardly, that he was not taking the sort of stand that Garvey would have appreciated. So I do think it is complex. I think it's there are a lot of contradictions in terms of how he viewed Ethiopia's potential and its leadership. But I'll allow Dr. Fikro Geber-Kidan to continue.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually I'll build on the point you mentioned last, the complexity. Garvey in general maintained a very complex, sometimes even antagonistic relationship with the African American intellectual elite, and that was very self-evident, in the debate that he and Du Bois had, over many things. Garvey was more like, he was much more comfortable, with Booker T. Washington than he was with Du Bois. But with regards to Ethiopia, I mean, when Marcus, we have to also put it in the context of time. When Marcus Garvey lived in London, that was in the late 1930s. He was really, he was almost like a forgotten figure within the, within the African American protest tradition. He wasn't the person he was in the 1920s. So he was very much, a lone ranger, and therefore it was easy for him, I think, to feel snubbed, as Dr. Nur Hussein said, and feel disgruntled. Possibly, he could also have been paid by Mussolini's agent. We should not ignore that possibility. But fortunately, his remarks actually did result in people, African-American newspapers, newspaper editors rallying behind Ethiopia. That also brings up the issue of how Ethiopia is viewed within the diaspora community. You know, there is that love-hate relationship. Today, we obviously focused on the positive side, on the romantic side, but you also had a small group within the African-American community that was very, very critical of Ethiopia for various reasons. So to a degree, Garvey's writings in 1937 pandered to those negative images of Ethiopia: slavery, dictatorship, primitive. So he was playing into that pre-existing image of Ethiopia. Thank you.
Okay. Any other from the panelists? Any point that you want to raise? There is a question that is actually partially, unless there is a feeling to. Professor Bahru, do you want to?
I'd like to make a couple of comments if there is time. Let me say that I've been very much fascinated by all the three presentations because they amplify in a way what I delivered yesterday in the keynote speech. The Back to Africa movement, a contemporary edition of Back to Africa movement by Eshion. The literary dimension of the African-American solidarity with Ethiopia during the fascist invasion by Nadia. And Fukro has unearthed a rather precious document which has eluded me in my search for the biography of Malaku. Because at that time I went to the Schomburg Center and I was able to discover quite a few documents. So I was really struck by this thing. Maybe you could say a few words about how you came across it. Maybe I did not follow you exactly correctly. How you found it, how it got there, and so on. What struck me was the contrast between Dubois' relationship with Ethiopia and Garvey's relationship, rather troubled relationship. I think Nadia has alluded to that. Not only did he falsify history by saying that Haile Selassie fled and Kantiba Nasibu died on the battlefield, but he even he became an apologist for the fascist order, saying at one stage actually that Ethiopia probably would, it's probably through Italy that Ethiopia shall stretch her hands unto God, kind of recognizing something that was really a very powerful motto for Ethiopia as well as for African Americans. So I'm really glad by the presentation, but maybe Fukro, you could say a few more words about the document, how you came across it, where is it available now, and so on. Thank you.
Yes. Could you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So that document right now, it's actually available through the University of Massachusetts. All Du Bois's personal papers have been digitized, and actually they're open access. You could even Google it. But if you check, say, if you were to Google under Du Bois personal papers, it would take you to the University of Massachusetts database. And if one were to search under Ethiopia, there would be at least over 400 results. So you could easily, search for Kentiba Gebru or Malaku Bayan, and then it's very easy to access. It's open access, and there are about a dozen letters of correspondence between Du Bois and Bayan. So there is actually much more about Malaku Bayan that we have access to right now because of that database than we had before when Professor Bahru was writing his book. So there's the information is out there. It's open access.
Okay, two questions that have been on the screen.
Thank you, and nice to meet you again after so long. Thank you.
Well, same to you, Gash Bahru. But አሁን ደስ ያለኝ ከአንተ ጋር በመነጋገር ያድሮም አንተ ስለምልህ ነው። እና በጣም አመሰግናለሁኝ። ታንክ ዩ።
Okay.
ኢትዮጵያ ስመጣ እፈልግሃለሁ።
We'll see if we can translate that later on.
Sorry, I just said that when I come to Ethiopia, hopefully, we'll have a lunch together.
Okay. Great.
Thank you.
So, there is one question that's been on the screen for a while from Rubel Teklia. I feel like it was partially answered, but I will raise it here. It says Haile Selassie is still viewed and assessed differently by his Ethiopian Eritrean subject on one hand, and often romanticizing Black diaspora, on the other. What is the source of that discontent? Anybody could try to answer that. I thought partially it was discussed, but it would be okay to just, I feel like still there is a lingering question there. Nadia?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've already addressed what I think is the tension, because I think that, as I mentioned, the ideology of Ethiopianism, which goes back from, actually earlier than the 19th century, but 19th century is probably when it is kind of consolidated as a something called Ethiopianism. There's some kind of resistance to critique in that's embedded in the ideology, I believe, so that it became difficult to question imperial culture, because it seemed to be part and parcel of Ethiopianism. And so even though I think that I'm just repeating myself, but I think, I think there is a kind of indirect, sometimes, attempt to, question and critique, but it cannot really come to the surface, because I think that it's not allowed within, or it's not welcomed within the ideology. So that was my view on it.
Okay, one question that was also, on the chat, or the question answer, is that I think it is to Fikral. It says to drop an accusation that Garvey may have been paid by Mussolini without evidence sounds problematic.
Well, I said possibly. Well, I say that also in the context of actually what I had come across in the voice papers. I have come across very strange correspondence between some people living in Italy, claiming to be Ethiopians, and corresponding with Du Bois. This was like around 1932. Very, very strange correspondence, a series of them. So my interpretation of those letters perhaps were done by some Italian spies. They were trying to convince Du Bois that Ethiopia had nothing to offer to Black Americans, but they were doing it in a very, very surreptitious, in a very clever way. So based on that, I would not be surprised. I didn't say that's what happened, but I said I wouldn't be surprised if Garvey actually was paid by Mussolini or his agents. Remember, Garvey was a Catholic too. Garvey was a Catholic, so Mussolini could have used that as a possible ground for tapping into Garvey's support for Italy.
Okay, one very interesting question actually just came up, and that comes from pop culture. Alpha Abebe said, "Thanks for a great panel. If you have viewed parts of Beyonce visual album Black is King, you will have seen how much she draws on antiquated and romanticized images of Black and African royalty and elitism, which has sparked some interesting public debate. Are we seeing a resurgence of parochial and depoliticized representation of African past being marshaled by the wider Black diaspora to counter the flood of images of Black death and oppression in times of Black Lives Matter?" Any of you can take this, or any other person.
Just for the record, I'm blind, therefore I have no idea what he's referring to. I've heard about it, so I defer this to either well, to my colleagues.
I actually have not seen it yet, and it's been on it's been a plan of mine to see it, but I haven't seen it yet. But it's a very interesting question, whether there is something in the particular moment in as the question mentions, you know, to counter the flood of images of Black Death, that there needs to be a kind of that there is a kind of desire to turn to something to restore a kind of dignity, and that royalty in a kind of as the question points out, like depoliticized way is seen as somehow somehow restorative. I don't know. I mean, it is an interesting question. I don't really have unfortunately an informed way of answering it because I haven't seen the visual album yet. So
you just say Russell Rickford, you will find a good essay, and it's actually raised a lot of discussion among people. I just feel the question sometimes is unfair, being an art historian, is that when you talk about the literary or artistic or visual imagination, I mean, I think there is something about it that is cannot be judged by these kind of political measurements. I mean, throughout history, even if you look at the presentation here, and especially Nadia's references to poetry, are we going to judge these genres by ethnographic, accuracy? Are we going to say to artists, don't, because now when you think about the kind of like, if you think about the postmodern condition, and if you think about, let's say, just the genre of rap and in pop culture, citations, mixing, and all of those things became creative tools of recreation of the past in a way that is, I think I'm against limiting the freedom of the artist in terms of how they should do things according to a specific, of course, the yardstick of ethics and so forth, and accuracy may play a role. But I think in artistic creativity, we will have to allow that kind of a space that for people to be creative. And if that is an image in a museum, it's, you deconstruct, you mix, you select. I mean, there is a lot of things that happen in the creative process that is different. And in the case of Beyonce, I didn't see the whole thing, but I've seen part of it, just my interest, because a lot of people ask me whether that art piece that she used as a headdress. I mean, one of them is actually from where I came from Northern Sudan. And I mean, some Sudanese were really happy with it at the level of pop culture, that Beyonce cited something out of ancient Sudanese item or motif. And hers is a very Pan-African selective, but it's also arbitrary to some extent. And I think it's part of the recreative processes that of the creative process. There are like different items that the mind goes into, or visually, and recompose them in another way, in a genre that is cinema. But it's also, you have to remember, Beyonce is not doing this alone. There is a whole set of filmmakers and researchers and fashion designers. So there's something else that, there's another lens through which that we could actually judge. But I would love to listen to others that reflecting on this. There are several people here. Elizabeth Georges, who's an art historian, Dagmar Wubschit.
I just want to say, Salah, just to add to Alpha Abavi's comment. That was a very good comment that she brought up. So the same thing is happening in Ethiopia too, romanticizing. As the politics grow harsher and harsher, romanticizing Haile Selassie has become a new thing. So, just Teddy Afro, for example, the singer Teddy Afro, goes back to the royalty to look for a united Ethiopia, you know. So that kind of thing is happening in Ethiopia too. So I just wanted to endorse what, I haven't seen Beyonce's thing, but I just wanted to endorse what Alpha commented on.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I went to, I mean, I visited Ethiopia a couple of years ago. My second time going there, the first time for the conference you organized, you know, for the Akalalu conference. And I was surprised to see on the back of, you know, so many bajajes, you see pictures of, you know, Menelik or Selassie or Tewodros, or, you know, just there's a kind of resurgence of, it seems like, fascination with Ethiopian royalty in Ethiopia.
So uncritical nostalgia. So it's very dangerous too. So,
but you also have to put it in the context, and in the context of the larger picture, which is on the one hand to this anything Ethiopian, the culture, the food, well, there are many languages, but the Amharic language, the script. So on the one hand, there is this, I don't even know where it came from. It's very atavistic. So to this anything Ethiopian. So as a result of that, we have the resurgence, we have the revival of Ethiopianism within the Ethiopian context.
Yeah.
Okay, Sala, can I just quickly add? Let's see, can you turn your volume? That it's also the case that among Ethiopians in the diaspora, especially young people, in part because of the large power of reggae music, the way in which iconographies of Haile Selassie show up, T-shirts, so on and so forth, because as immigrants from a poor country in the contemporary, Haile Selassie still wields enormous amount of prestige in the global stage. And again, especially via reggae music. So sometimes you see that as a way to give yourself some kind of cover as an immigrant, quite often hailed through images of hunger and so on and so forth. So that romanticized notion is in Ethiopia, is in the diaspora. It's also among Ethiopians in the diaspora in the world.
I one more chance for one comment or a question, and then we end it. We have gone over time.
Salah, just a disclaimer from Fuad Maki. The question regarding Garvey, for some reason, appeared under my name, but it's not from me. Okay, there must be a technical glitch of some sort.
Okay, thank you so much, Fuad. I mean, I thought I edited it. So I'm glad that I edited that part. It doesn't sound strange, but it sounds like Trumpian. So I took that part out. Anyway, so let me just end it here. And I really want to thank you all, Nadia, Aishan, and Fikre, for really very inspiring, enlightening presentations, and also the discussion and all the colleagues that kind of interjected or intervened and gave comments. And I think that would be great. We actually, at some point, just going back to Beyonce and pop culture, is that we are trying to do a panel soon as part of our, on the idea of cultural appropriation in general. And so we may have somebody who can talk about this specifically as in one example, but among other issues. That is how cultural appropriation, especially cultural appropriation of black culture in general, appropriation of black culture. So thank you so much. I just want to ask everybody as a panelist to leave the panel, but actually join through the special, and this is also goes for the attendee. For the next session, you have to join through another link that we've sent you. So there's a link for each panel, but for participant and panelists, we've sent you a special link so you can intervene and talk and also appear within the panel system. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.